You're listening to Gospel Centered Rest, a podcast by Grace Bible Church in Cambridge, Ontario, dealing with topics of life and theology, and how Christ's promise of rest for the weary and heavy laden gives us strength for today and hope for tomorrow.
Well, welcome back to Gospel Centered Rest. We're so glad that you've joined us. We're again here with myself, Tyler, and Byron and David, the three of us who are pastors here at Grace Bible Church. And we're continuing our discussion about caring for one another, and in particular, cultivating meaningful relationships. And we thought we would talk about this within the context of what's been going on the last several months with the pandemic, with COVID-19, and the response of the church, and in particular, our response as a church to what's been happening and how we've adjusted, and the things that God's been teaching us through this, and what it means to care for one another during this time. David and Byron, what a topic for us to be talking about. Looking forward to this conversation, as we know that there's so many different opinions that are out there. We've seen a wide variety of response, even from churches within our area and beyond. So I guess like the big question of this discussion is, why did we respond the way we did? What are some of the fundamentals of why we responded? So David, is there something in particular you could think of that could really start this conversation?
Yeah, there's obviously a lot that's going on, a lot that changes week by week. Even how things come through the media, some of it's conflicting, some of it changes the next day. One person hears one thing, another person hears another thing. So in some ways, what we're going through, we see results of it, but it's still very confusing. So just the sheer diversity of how people understand this, how people respond to it, I think has been a challenge. But if there is an overall mindset or heart set that we have, as leadership, have tried, it is the word shepherding just comes to mind. And obviously, I mean, the Bible talks a lot about that, but in Ezekiel 34, Ezekiel is, the shepherds weren't shepherding the sheep, and this is what it says in Ezekiel 34:3. You eat the fat, wear the wool, and butcher the fattened animals, but you do not tend the flock. And so that's what we've tried to do, is tend the flock in all our limitations, but to be among the flock, to be with the flock as much as we can. And then it says in verse 4, you have not strengthened the weak, healed the sick, bandaged the injured, brought back the strays, or sought the lost. And I think what's instructive about that verse is it talks about physical ailments. It talks about our physical presence, our physical body. And so some people are extremely scared of what's happening, and other people are responding where they don't really have a concern. And so what we've And so instead of being navigating by people's opinions, to take the heart of not only Ezekiel 34, but also other places where it talks about leaders shepherding, and say, okay, we want to do a good job with what we understand at this time, to be sensitive to people's fears, and to try to move forward as best we can, but what guides us is we want to tend the flock.
And I think that's good, because that highlights, probably we'd all agree, that two of the biggest challenges that we faced as a church, as pastors, one being the various responses that we've seen from people that we love and we care about, even our own families, and also what that looks like to care for the congregation, what that looks like to continue to shepherd, as you're describing, David, in a new setting where for the first several weeks it was complete shutdown. I mean, you couldn't look at people in the face anymore. Like you couldn't meet together. That really changes things. And I know personally for me, that was like, that took some time to try to navigate and to try to figure out. And I still don't even think I've completely figured it out yet, but you go from just naturally seeing people every week on a Sunday to not seeing them. So you take for granted even just that quick, it could just be moments of FaceTime that you have with people on a Sunday, and that's gone out of the picture. So I know that's been a challenge to try to figure out how to navigate that. What about you, Byron?
It's definitely an ongoing challenge to figure out, okay, how do you balance this? Like in one sense, for us, being newer in the Cambridge area, we didn't have so many contacts. So having the contacts eliminated didn't seem such a major change because we hadn't made contacts yet in one sense. But even then, still as the time has gone on, you're very much aware of that isolation and missing the connection. And Zoom is it's a great thing, better than nothing, but it sure isn't the same as being with somebody. So that balance and what's wise and how do you be gracious and how to recognize some things help certain people and don't help others. Right. And as David mentioned, people are in very different positions. So caring for the body as a whole, not just for people who happen to agree with my particular outlook or somebody else's.
Pretty good. So I guess that can transition into our next segment, just discussing some of the lessons that we've learned. There's a number of things that I know that we could all say that we've learned during this time, but what are some things you think, David, that we've learned as a church and maybe as individuals as we've navigated this as best as we could, following the Lord's direction and leading?
Yeah, I would say probably I've learned the importance of community, which sounds odd because I think we know the importance of community. I think maybe a better way to say it is I've learned to understand the importance of community in a different way. So we have been inconvenienced by COVID, meaning the church shut down. Even now, there are certain things that we can and cannot do. But in all of that, at least in my generation, my lifetime, there was never a time where you could not go to church. That was never removed for an extended period of time. Now we know that around the world, there are churches that go through that, and the Lord protects and the Lord gives what's necessary in those moments. And so I think seeing community when it's not the way that it has always been, you're not able to meet. So the value of community. And then I think the other thing that I've learned is how the church has really cared for one another. So we started out by talking about challenges. It is amazing how the Grace family has cared for one another. They have made this about others, many of them, and looked for ways to reach out and to connect with people, and that happened especially at the beginning. People were saying, how can we help? What can we do? So not just the importance of community, but you see that when you go through something like this, the value of community, that we may not have been able to meet, but community underneath it all was still happening. And that's just such a blessing. And to be part of Grace Bible Church and to watch that unfold as the church lived that out. And again, not perfectly like us, not perfectly, but they lived that out, and that's a tremendous encouragement to see God work during a very difficult time.
And I would say even part of that is like I echo everything you say. That's been a tremendous thing to watch and to experience. But I would say also part of that is watching as people, and myself included, and us in this room and others even still learning how to get along when there's different opinions, and regardless of the opinion, just caring for one another. Some person might be anti-mask and some person might be pro-mask, but to see that person who's anti-mask to put a mask on before they meet with the pro-mask person or whatever, like just different ways that we've been able to watch people just get along for the sake of the gospel and the love of one another. Even when they may have a strong opinion in one way or the other, but I've seen that as a major lesson. What about you, Byron?
Yep, putting that, it becomes so practical, right? How do we, in everyday terms, put somebody else's needs ahead of my own? And obviously, we have to get a feel for where are they, what are they struggling with, what can we do to help or support or just be there, presence. And that's been neat to see.
And that's the church.
Yeah.
It's always been the church. We have differences, like the foundation, the primary issues bind us together, but then there's differences in certain understandings of passages or just levels of maturity. And I think it's tested the church. I think it's purified the church. I think it's humbled the church. Yeah, certainly humbled us as leaders. To see, first of all, some of the responses in our own heart, and then to be able to say, like we see in Romans, that what takes place is God brings us through these sufferings, but He does this amazing thing of maturing us, and He has this way to even bring hope. And to refocus us back on Christ. And so I love Philippians 3 that talks about, we're going to have our differences, but God will bring us together, and He'll show us. And as we seek to live graciously with one another, this is such a good time. I think that's one of the big picture, the small picture is COVID. The big picture is, fruit of the Spirit. Yeah. How do we live together? Or just big moments in our life. And I think two of them for me are grace. How do we just show grace to one another? Yeah. And then humility. How do we walk humbly? And this is an incredible opportunity that the church has to share the gospel. And the gospel not just being the saving gospel, but living the gospel in love and truth before one another. So this grace, this humility, and to know that we are loved by God. He has not abandoned us. He has not abandoned His church. We are loved by God. And then we take that love, because the world's watching. The world watches the church. And how do we use this time in a world that's filled with anxiety and fear and hurt? There's people who have been hurt by this, and they see us loving God and loving one another.
Yeah, and one of the questions we were asking right from the beginning was, what could God be teaching us during a time like this, during a moment like this as a church? And I love that we were asking this question, because it led to a sermon series that you preached on, David, through the book of 1 Peter, which then really became the framework for us as to how we were going to care for one another and love one another during this time and look at things from the big picture, as you had mentioned. And we see from 1 Peter the sufferings that these people were going through, and it almost seems like trying to compare us to and what we're going through to Peter and what the people that he's writing to are going through is there a comparison? I mean, they were going through some seriously intense persecution. They were afraid for their lives, like literally. But just to see how even the answers that Peter gives and direction that he gives with the gospel impacts those individuals, has a huge impact just on a daily plane for us today in the church and in the situation. He hits on government and how to respond to the government. He hits on how does it look to what does it look like to love somebody through suffering, and what are the internal perspectives we can have on suffering? What's God doing? What's the big picture of what God is doing through this time? And can we trust God and His sovereignty through this time? And Peter keeps bringing it back to, yes, we can trust God. His sovereignty, His plan is the best plan. He's in control of all things. And the gospel gives us the hope and the assurance of what we need today and for tomorrow. So I just love that we kept bringing that back to the conversation as we were discussing how to handle different aspects of ministry during this time. When do we open? How are we going to open? Well, it all comes back to the answers we see Peter gives. That it's exactly how we're going to care for one another.
And just to remind some of the big picture, 1 Peter 4:1, therefore, since Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same understanding. Obviously, there's various ways to suffer, but we will suffer, and we will suffer just generally. And not just for Christ. Verse 8, above all, maintain constant love for one another, since love covers a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without complaining, and then using your gifts that God's given. And those are some of the reminders and big picture moments that happened for us as leadership as we went through this.
When you say love covers a multitude of sins, you think how very practical it gets in terms of, okay, how are you going to love somebody who's sinning against you? And obviously that can take a million different forms, but how do you love people who disagree with you? How do you love people who feel very strongly, they make it a political issue, or they make it a faith issue, and they take very, very strong positions on it. And Peter doesn't say, well, just love the people that come to the same conclusion you do.
Right.
But okay, how do we love each other and allow each other the freedom to have some differences, and yet treat each other in a godly way?
Love that. Good. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Is there anything final that's burning that you'd like to share before we close off today?
I think for me, just thanksgiving to God for grace, the Grace Bible family, and really the grace that they've shown to one another, even the grace that they've shown to the leadership. There has been just a tremendous amount of encouragement from the Grace family to us, and we're just thankful to be able to be reminded of the freedoms that we have, the gifts that God has given us, and the beauty and the value of family, of community, and to know that we pray for and love the family, and it has been an incredible privilege to walk and journey with and mature, all of us mature, and see life maybe a little differently during this time. So in the challenges, sometimes you're awakened to just the everyday blessings that you took for granted, but then you see it, and you see the challenges that come out of church, and yet the church is still loving, the church is still serving, still rejoicing in God's word, the gospel, living out the gospel before one another. So just a lot of thanksgiving to God during this time.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Thank you.
Thanks, Tyler.
And
Glad to.
appreciate that we can sit down, we can have this discussion with one another.